A lot of the critics of third-wave feminism will state that first and second-wave feminism were important fights to free women of oppression, and it's only really in recent times that feminism has lost its way after winning most, if not all, of the real battles. The argument goes that first-wave feminism, the suffragettes, fought for equality in voting rights, and that second-wave feminism fought for equality in the workplace during the 1970s. Whilst it is fair to say that some of the battles fought by these feminists were legitimate issues where women were disadvantaged over men, we should also not lose sight of the fact that these groups have always been purely interested in female advocacy, and men's rights and obligations have been largely ignored. Feminism has done a very successful job of rewriting history as the continual oppression of women at the hands of sexist and privileged men. If we consider that modern man has been around for approximately 50,000 years, based on when Homo sapiens started exhibiting behavioural modernity, then the feminist claim will go something along the lines of stating that 50% of the population has been oppressed for the first 49,900 years of mankind, and has only gained any liberty in the last 100 years. This of course begs the question, what on earth have women been doing all this time? After all, it's not exactly as if the battle for women's liberties has proved particularly challenging. Pretty much everything that has been campaigned for has been granted in a comparatively short space of time, certainly less than a decade or two. So why were women prepared to put up with this oppression for so long? Were they really so powerless all of this time? Well, the truth, of course, is that they weren't oppressed at all, and that feminism is merely a reflection of the changes to our society caused by the Industrial Revolution and other technological advances. It has also always been the case that women exert considerable power over men through the control of mating rights. Or to put it another way, men compete and women choose. So women get to determine which male traits are successful in the mating game. Of course, it shouldn't all be seen as some kind of competition between men and women. We have always wanted the best for our nearest and dearest, no matter what their gender. So what is the truth of our history and the history of feminism? We must first understand the way the world has been for most of that 50,000 years, and what we see as a world that could be described as extremely sexist. By that I mean that both men and women had highly defined roles, with no possibility of swapping these roles. We had different, but roughly equal, privileges and obligations. These gender-based roles were largely determined by biology, and to understand that we need to remember just how different the world used to be when it came to having children. The level of childhood mortality is simply incomprehensible to most people today. In 16th century England, it could be expected that approximately 12% of children would die in their first year, a further 24% between 1 and 6, and another 24% between 7 and 16. In total, fully 60% of all live births would die before their 16th birthday. It is for this reason that fertility rates were so high. Again, if we look at the average woman in the 16th century, she would expect to get married at the age of 23, which is probably older than many might have guessed, and she would then typically go on to have 6 or 7 children. It is quite clear then that the high birth rate was necessary to maintain the population, and was not because men were constantly forcing women to have sex and getting them pregnant, as some feminists have tried to frame it. 6 children with a 60% childhood mortality only gives a replacement rate of 2.4 adults to every woman, and it can be assumed that not all of them will go on to produce the required number of children. In fact, further evidence that the high birth rate was not inflicted on women by men can be seen by the fact that the birth rate dropped in line with childhood mortality long before modern contraception methods became available. Indeed, by 1900, the birth rate was down to 3.5 children per woman. What this meant for our pre-industrial society was that there was a need to have gender-based roles and a bargain between men and women that benefited both parties. As most women would spend the better part of 15 years being either pregnant or breastfeeding, then the ability to take on work outside of the home was very limited. This is not to say that the job of looking after a household with 7 children and no domestic appliances would not have been a substantial amount of work. But this is also not the only work that women did. In an agrarian economy, women have always done jobs that could be done in and around the home. Jobs such as making bread, honey, butter, preservatives, soap, candles, and even brewing beer, as water was often unsafe to drink. However, whilst women did significant work, it was only men that had sufficient time available to sell their labour to produce an income that could buy the essentials a family needed. On the other hand, men obviously needed women to procreate, but more significantly, men needed women's fidelity. The reason why women's fidelity has always been more important than men's is obvious when you think about it. A woman always knows that she is bringing up her own children, when a man has no such assurances, and we are surely programmed by evolution to want to pass on our own genes. These factors lead to the arrangement between men and women that men would give their surplus labour in the form of providing an income for the family in exchange for a commitment of female fidelity. Whilst this exchange didn't need to be for life, it would need, as a minimum, to cover the early childhood of all the offspring. As this covered such a large portion of adult life, we see that this grand exchange between men and women became normalised in our society as marriage and was seen as a commitment for life. As societies became more formalised, this social contract between men and women also became enshrined in law, and the law replicated the terms of the contract by enforcing the commitment for life. This wasn't only done by making divorce extremely hard to obtain, but it was also done by setting in law the privileges and obligations that both parties have. For this reason, we see that men have a legal obligation to provide for their wives for the rest of their lives, the only exception to this being a divorce and subsequent marriage. In other words, another man now has the obligation. Similarly, women's lack of legal financial independence committed them to the bargain by putting men in control of the family income and expenditure. Of course, women's fidelity could not be explicitly obligated in law, and instead this remained largely enforced by societal pressure. When it came to the children, the position was always very clear and very simple, that in the event of any separation, men would have custody over the children. The reason for this was simply that men had the financial obligation for the children, and so with the obligation came the privilege. This grand bargain between men and women all worked very well, or perhaps equally badly, but in any rate there was little pressure to make divorces easier, and both parties had an interest in maintaining the relationship. This all changed in the 18th and 19th century due to the massive changes brought about in our society caused by technological advancements, specifically industrialization, modern medicine and sanitation.